This is part 2 in a two-part video series on modeling and authoring techniques for a report that defaults to the latest period based on the user that's logged in. In the first video, we showed the modeling techniques used, which incorporated filters in the time dimension query subject. In this particular video, we're going to show the report authoring techniques used to achieve our goals. So let's quickly recap the report output before we get into the authoring techniques to achieve this report. There's two prompts. The first one allows us to select the fact period, so we can look at actual periods or planned periods. And the second one allows us to choose which period we want to look at. The report, when it initially runs, defaults to the latest period that the logged in user is allowed to see. So in this case, Frank Breton is a previewer of the data and has access to more periods than a regular user would have. If we switch to the planned periods, you'll see that it moves forward 1 quarter in time to 2014 Q2. There's no actual data, but there is planned data for that period, and this user has the ability to see that data. If we logged in as a regular user, they would only be able to see up until 2013 Q4, for example. Okay, so let's take a look at the techniques used to author this report. First, we'll take a look at the first prompt. This particular prompt consists solely of static choices that the author enters. In this case, we enter a use value of 1 and a display value of actual to display the actual period, or a use value of 2 and a display value of planned to display the planning periods. If we scroll down further in the properties, we can see the parameter used for this particular prompt is fact period. And remember, this is the parameter that comes from the model, the filter within the time dimension. And then we have a default selection for this particular prompt of 1. Which means display the actual period by default when the report runs. The second prompt is based on a query called query period selection, and we'll look at that shortly. It has sorting defined and says sort by the period SID in descending order. The use value is the period SID, and the display value is the period. So period SID and period. This is the user-friendly text that the user will see when they run the report. So again, a collection is defined here, and this is a single entry where the use value is 1, and the display value is latest period. And this is what we want to default to when we run the report. So if we scroll down again here in the properties, we'll take a look at the default selections, and it's set to 1 for latest period. And the parameter used for this particular prompt is period, and this is defined in a filter for the list object of this report, and we'll take a look at that shortly as well. So the list itself simply has period added to it from the metadata tree, and the actual fact and the planned fact. So let's take a look at the queries that support this particular report. The first one we'll look at is query period selection. That's the one that feeds the second prompt that we looked at. Again, it's very straightforward. It uses the period SID as the use value and the period as the display value. The next one we'll look at is query latest period. And query latest period is important in this piece because it actually returns the latest period for the logged in user. And this particular query is then referenced in the list query. So let's take a quick look at what's in this particular query. Again, we have period SID in here. And then we have a calculation that's called rank period SID. If we take a look at that, it's simply a ranking of the period SIDs that are returned for the particular user logged in descending order. And then we say, create a filter for that particular rank period SID and only return the one that is equal to 1. So only return the first in the list of that ranking, the number 1 rank period, which is the latest period for the logged in user. So let's quickly view the tabular data for this particular query to understand what's happening. So when we run this, again, the model is requesting a fact category SID, and in this particular case, 1, which equals actual periods, and that returns us simply one period, 2014-01. If we run it again and change the fact category SID to 2, so to planned periods, and click OK, it returns us 2014-02. So we're just taking the top one in the list that's returned. If I disable this filter and rerun the tabular data, we'll simply have a descending list of periods that this particular user is allowed to see. Again, at the top of the list is 2014-01, followed by the remaining periods. If I ran it again and change it to planned periods, then we would have one extra period, 2014-02. And again, because it's at the top of the list, that's the one we're interested in as being the latest period. We'll just re-enable this. Now let's take a look at the final query, the one that feeds the list object on the report. Again, it's straightforward. It simply displays the period from the time dimension and then actual and planned facts. And all the logic is done here in the filter. So again, the parameter period is defined here for the first time in the report in this filter. And it says if period is equal to 1, which is the default value for the latest period that we want to see, and the period SID from this query is found in the query latest period, then return that value. So again, this is where query latest period is referenced. The second condition says, using the OR operator, if period is not equal to 1, then simply return me the period SID that was selected from the drop-down list of the period prompt object. So let's run the report again, just so we can understand that filter logic. So again, the default value for the first prompt is 1, which is actual, and the second prompt also defaults to 1, which is the latest period. So the filter logic says, if period is equal to 1, which in this case it is, and the period SID is found in the underlying query latest periods query, which in this case is 2014-01, then return this row. If we now switch this to something other than the default of 1, the filter logic will say where period is not equal to 1 and the period SID is equal to the period SID selected from this drop-down list. And of course, because we're logged in as Frank Breton, we have access to more data than a regular user would. So if we select latest period, again, this takes us all the way up to 2014 Q2. So I've taken the time to log out and log back in as Jeff Waters. And we can see that the results, again, are different for the default latest period. We are now at 2013 Q4. So remember, in the model itself, there are 3 filters in the time dimension. 1, to identify the currently logged in user using the session parameter. 2, to identify which fact period we want to look at, actual or planned. And 3, what type of user are we dealing with? A previewer or a regular user? And has the flag for the data been set to yes or no? Has it passed the preview stage or not? And then our particular report introduces one more parameter, which is the period. To default to the latest period, the value of 1, or an item that is selected by the end user, the consumer of the data, which is simply the period SID. So you can see, using the modeling techniques and the report authoring techniques, we are able to fairly easily create a report that defaults to a specific period for a specific user when they run the report.